Hello and welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Callahan and I coordinate Counselor Connect, which is operated by the Central Indiana Educational Service Center, or CIESC, in Indianapolis. While we are located in the Indianapolis area, we do offer statewide support to school counselors and school social workers. So we're glad you're here. This is our kind of kickoff session for this new school year, our first free virtual session. So we are glad that you have joined us. This is being recorded, as you can see. So if you have to jump off early for whatever reason, maybe you have children running around your home still for the summer, I get it, then that's fine. It will be recorded and available on demand for you to access later. As you can see on this opening slide, we do have the slide deck. So if you do want to follow along, there's a bit.ly there. I will grab it here in just a minute also and put it into the chat if you want to just click on it for a little bit easier access. I'm thrilled to have Elisa Kazarowski join us today. She is going to be talking about the impact of trauma and chronic stress on the brain, learning, and behavior. So obviously a very relevant topic, and hopefully this will help as you plan for the new school year and welcoming all of your students back. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Elisa to get us started. Thanks, Elisa.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. The kids running around the house absolutely 100% describes my house right now. And hopefully, well, my kids usually know better than to bust on in. But hopefully we can't hear them in the background, because who knows what is happening downstairs in my house this morning. So we've got about a week left until our school starts back. So welcome. I'm so glad that you all are here this morning with me. And we're going to just kind of dive right in. We have an hour this morning. There we go. So there's a little bit about me. Thank you, Amanda, for introducing me. Again, my name is Elisa Kazarowski. I have spent several decades, a couple of decades now in education, doing most of the jobs in a school, I like to say. But now I own a consulting company, and this is what I do. I travel all over via my computer and in person, and teach teachers and counselors and social workers about kids and how trauma and chronic stress impact them. And I've kind of added in that chronic stress term because I don't really love the term trauma anymore, for a lot of different reasons. Because for one, it kind of makes us think that our kids have to have experienced this big traumatic event in order to be impacted and have some of these things that we're going to talk about today. And that's really just not the case. And we're going to talk through that. So what kind of teacher would I be, right, if I didn't give you learning objectives? So there they are. I'm not going to read through them all, but these are all the things that we're going to cover here in the next hour. So let's just start off talking, right as soon as I said I don't love the word trauma. It's on my first slide, of course. But what do I mean by trauma? And then we're going to switch and kind of talk about chronic stress in just a minute also, and sort of what the differences are. But if we're looking for a textbook definition of trauma, there it is, up on your screen: the experience of an event that's painful, distressful, and can have lasting impacts on our kids. If we're talking about that sort of big T trauma, how it's kind of referred to sometimes, these are the big traumatic experiences that some of our kids, a lot of our kids, experience. Then that can happen in three different ways. And you see those right here in front of you. The first is something that is done to a child. So that's where abuse comes in, violence in their home, in their community, but also things like a natural disaster is something that happens to our kids, right? A tornado that wipes out a town, or a hurricane coming through their city, that impacts them in a lot of ways. Our second type of trauma is when it's sort of the opposite, when they're missing things. And so if we're thinking about our, the hierarchy of basic needs, our kids maybe are missing some of those basic needs, whether that is shelter and food, or somebody that truly loves them and cares for them and is making sure that all of those needs are met. So this is where neglect comes in. But also keep in mind, I know in my school we had a lot of this. We certainly have parents that are neglectful, that, you know, it's purposeful, they have no interest in parenting or whatever the reason is. But we also have a lot of parents who end up neglecting their kids because they are working 3 or 4 jobs trying to keep food on the table, and they're not home. Or we have parents on the flip side who are working 80 hours a week in a very high powered job, and so their kids are left fending for themselves. So that neglect is not always intentional. It's not always because a parent is truly just not wanting to parent. Sometimes they're just trying to do their best, but that still kind of falls into that second category. And then our third category is when something happens to somebody that our kids love, that they care for, maybe a family friend, a parent, somebody in their family, a caregiver, and that affects them in some way. So this could be a health diagnosis, it could be death of a loved one, incarceration, divorce. So whatever it is, it's not directly impacting the child, but it is most certainly indirectly impacting them in probably a lot of different ways. So there are 2 other things that I want to point out about trauma when we're talking about this big T trauma. And that is the first being that trauma can be a one-time experience, or it can be a chronic state of life. So a chronic state of life, we probably all know those kids where they're living in a situation where they're dealing with regular abuse or neglect. The flip side of that, though, would be thinking about, we live in Indiana, right? We have lots of tornadoes. Let's think about a town that has a tornado that has come through and has wiped out schools and businesses and homes, and there's a lot of loss and there's a lot of rebuilding that's going to need to happen. That would be considered a one-time experience, even though the people in that town will be dealing with the aftermath of that tornado for weeks, maybe months, maybe even years. It's one thing that happened. It's a one-time event. And eventually, the people in that town will return to some sort of normal. It might be a new type of normal, but it's not something that is going to continue impacting their life day in and day out for the rest of their lives. So that's what I mean by a one-time experience. The thing about those 2 kind of ends of the spectrum is that they can have the exact same effect on the human and the human brain and how we process through that trauma, depending on who we are, our genetic makeup, how we process our emotions and things that happen to us. And so one is not better, quote unquote, than the other. So just kind of keep that in mind. And the last statement on this slide is that the traumatic event can be real or it can be perceived. And this can be tricky for some of us to understand. This is sort of what I'm getting at here is the iceberg effect. If we have kids that are experiencing real trauma, it's happening, we know, that they're being abused at home, that's easy to wrap our brains around. But what I mean by the perception of trauma is maybe a kid who's been in the foster care system for many years, but has now been adopted by their foster family or one of their foster families. And so as the adult in the situation, we know that that child is not going to be going back to their abuser, the person that hurt them or caused the trauma. We know it's been through the court system. That's not right, logical. As we also know, kids are not the most logical, creatures on the planet. And so we have a lot of kids out there who are kind of walking around with this mentality of like the other shoe is going to drop mentality. At some point, all of these good things are going to be taken away, and I'm going to be right back in that situation that I was in. And no, it doesn't make sense to us, but it makes perfect sense to them because of their past experiences. And so they're kind of walking around with that perception of trauma. it's when I said the iceberg effect, we see, right, what's on top of the water. And what's on top of the water maybe in this case is, oh, they live with a decent family who loves them and cares for them and is providing for them and giving them these great experiences. But what we don't see is the part of the iceberg that's under the water, and all of that, the past and the things that that kid is expecting is going to just happen again at any given moment. And so that's what I mean by the perception of trauma. And those can both, again, be just as damaging to our kids. There's not one that's better than the other, just as I said with the last statement. So just a couple of like things to sort of keep in your back pocket, food for thought, as you are working with kids. So switching gears slightly, then what about chronic stress? What do I mean by that? And at the bottom, I have put, think about the pandemic. A lot of us went through or have experienced chronic stress because of the pandemic. And that's just one example that's kind of fresh in everybody's mind, and that's why I use that. So chronic stress is just that day in, day out. It feels relentless, right? We all kind of experience that at some point or another, where it was like, if we have to stay within these four walls for one more day, we're going to lose our minds, right? And it was just that stress of our lives being upturned. And I think about my kids when I'm thinking about this chronic stress. My kids lived during the pandemic in a pretty ideal situation. Mom's a teacher, and so, I could supplement, and make sure that they were on track and learning the things that they needed to learn, despite there not being much of a plan from the district, because who can plan for something like this? Mom and dad were both working from home. Nobody lost their job. Nobody was furloughed. We had plenty of food to eat. There was nothing that would really cause my kids to feel like, everything is unraveling. And yet they, just like many, many kids and adults out there, felt like things were unraveling because their whole normal had been taken away from them. They were not seeing their friends regularly. They couldn't go certain places. They didn't have those connections with the adults at school, or, the ability to play sports. That impacted their social emotional health, like it did for many of us. And that's sort of one example of what I'm getting at here with this chronic stress. It can impact us in a lot of the same ways as trauma does. And our response to it depends on all of these different factors, just like our response to a traumatic experience depends on all of these factors. What protective factors we have in place, that we've built up throughout our lives. Our genes, our past experiences, our emotional IQ, the coping skills or mechanisms that we've learned in our lives. So there's a lot that goes into it. And so I just want to make sure that we don't discount the idea of just stress in our lives and in our kids' lives and how they're dealing with things, because for a lot of our kids, that stress is just as harmful as, a kid who's experienced trauma. All right. So what does all this mean then? This honestly is one of my favorite things to teach teachers, because this is not something that we're regularly taught. And if you're a counselor or a social worker, you likely have a little bit more experience with this. But that's when I say you are in a great position to help out the teachers in your building, because we all know that there are a lot of missing pieces in higher ed, and the state of where we are at this point, this is one of those that teachers need to understand. And it looks very complicated if you're looking at this, but it's really not. We're going to break it down. This is the polyvagal theory. So when we're thinking, how does trauma impact the brain? This is how. And we're going to go through all of these different ways. This is basically flight, fight, freeze, which is something that we've all heard of. We've probably not seen it in a graphic like this. And so it looks like, oh, that's so much and that's so complicated, but it's really not. And so let's start at the bottom, social engagement. Social engagement is really the ideal. It's where we want ourselves to be. It's where we want our kids to come into school and be. And it's the ideal because that's not always the way it is for all of our kids, right? When we're in social engagement, we're feeling calm and balanced. We're at peace. So hopefully most of you sitting at your computer this morning are in social engagement, meaning you're ready to listen and learn new things. You can think through things from other people's perspectives, perhaps. You feel present and grounded in this moment, and you're just ready to go for the day. Maybe you're not super joyful, right? Maybe you're feeling a little tired, like I am, or a little bit hungry, also like I am. But for the most part, you feel good. That's social engagement.
Right.
If you look at this little wavy line that looks like ocean waves, that is where a lot of us operate. And what I mean by that is we have our ups and downs, right? Maybe we move into flight or fight at times because we all do. We all have stress in our lives and we all get angry and overwhelmed and anxious. But we have those coping skills or different strategies that we can use to bring ourselves back into balance. So think for a minute, what do you do when you are feeling really overwhelmed at work or really frustrated with your kids or whatever that emotion is? Maybe you go out and you go for a run, or maybe you get on the phone with your best friend, or you get in the bath, or whatever it is, you read a book, you take a walk. We all have these strategies that we use to kind of bring ourselves back down. I know personally, I use exercise a lot as my way of de-escalating. There's lots of healthy and unhealthy strategies, right? And as long as we don't use the unhealthy ones all the time, that's okay. When I ask this question at a school, 99% of the time, somebody will raise their hand and say either, I drink a glass of wine, or I eat some chocolate, or I eat pizza, or whatever it is. That's fine, as long as we don't do that every single day, right? Because that's when it's a slippery slope into those coping skills becoming unhealthy coping skills. And that's how addiction happens, because people don't have healthy coping mechanisms to use to bring themselves back into that state of balance. And some of those things feel really good in the moment, right? But then when you overuse them, obviously not so great in the long term. So most of us have these skills that we're able to live on this little wavy line. When we don't have skills and strategies, and we start moving up this bigger bell curve because we become escalated, you'll see the arrow on the side says arousal increases. Sometimes I use the word we become escalated or activated in some way. Basically, it just means we're feeling a feeling, and that feeling is not making us feel great. So what happens then is we first move into flight mode, and I'm going to break this down even more in just a minute. Excuse me. But I want to keep this graphic in front of you for just a moment. So first we're going to move into flight mode. And if that doesn't work, we're going to move into fight mode. And as I go through these other slides, you'll see that flight does not necessarily mean just running away. And fight does not necessarily mean fighting with our fists or our feet or, whatever our kids are using, teeth. So there's a little bit more to it than just those kind of, on the definition that we kind of think of when we hear flight or fight. If those don't work, then eventually we could possibly move into freeze mode. We don't see a whole ton of this like in a classroom or a school situation on kind of a really big level. But basically, we're going to keep moving up this bell curve until somehow we start de-escalating and we can start moving moving back down the bell curve. But in order to de-escalate, we need to have some things in place that a lot of our kids don't have right now. So let's break this down even more. So looking at social engagement, I talked about this one a little bit already. Social engagement, we're happy, we're peaceful, we're eating and sleeping normally or as normal, for us as possible. We can relate to others on an emotional level. We're just calm. Our body is open to listening to other people, learning from other people, seeing things from other people's perspectives. But as we move up that bell curve, like I said, we start to move into flight or fight mode. Now, keep in mind, this can happen, this flight or fight mode, it's really can happen on a spectrum. So if we're thinking, I'll give you a couple of examples, sort of like one really big example, like a very intense example. If I'm walking down the street at night and it's late, it's dark, I'm by myself, think about if you're on your own and you're in that situation and for whatever reason, maybe you sense a person behind you or around you, or there is a car that's driving a little bit slowly near you, but for whatever reason, you become hyper aware. That's your amygdala being activated. Your amygdala is your brain smoke alarm, and it's saying, hey, we might have a problem here. You might need to be aware of what's going on, be more aware of your surroundings. So your amygdala is going off, and you just kind of get that feeling of, I need to be really aware. Maybe you start to feel a little tingly, like on your arms. Maybe it's like that, the saying, like the hair on the back of your neck is standing up, or maybe your hands start to sweat a little bit. That's you becoming hyper aware, because your amygdala, when it is activated, is going to start sending some different chemicals and hormones throughout your body that you may need if you are truly in danger. So we sense that danger, so we go into flight mode first. Flight mode does not necessarily mean that I start running like a crazy person down the street, right? Trying to get away from this phantom thing. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So it could be that I become hyper aware and I think, okay, I need to get myself out of this situation, this potential situation. Is there a building I can go into? Am I close to my car? Is there a group of people across the street that I could go be close to so that I'm not by myself? That is flight. It's not necessarily, running for your life to get out of a situation. It's also all of those little micro things that we do to keep ourselves safe. That all kind of falls under that category of flight. Now, if as I'm trying to get myself to a place where I'm safe, it becomes obvious that there is a danger and there is somebody following me and that person is getting closer, and maybe that person even comes up and begins hurting me or attacking me or whatever that looks like, our brain is going to recognize very quickly, okay, we really need to get out of this situation now. And then flight does become, I'm running away, I'm getting myself away. If flight doesn't work, if you're unsuccessful, then you're going to move into fight mode. Now, you might be thinking, as I'm talking about kids that seem to skip over flight mode. And I'm going to come back and talk about this more in a few minutes, but we do have kids that seemingly go from social engagement straight into fight mode. And they're really not, and I'm going to explain this in a minute, but think about for a second your kids that, excuse me, they respond to something. Maybe somebody looks at them the wrong way or calls them a name, something that, isn't nice, but it's not the biggest deal. And they react like, so the thing that happens is sort of here on this level, and their reaction is way up here. And you think, these are the kids that you think, why did they just totally lose it over that seemingly small thing? Those are the kids that I'm talking about. And we're going to come back to them in a minute. Those are the kids that I'm talking about, that when I say that it seems like they skip over flight and they move straight into fight mode. And we'll talk about why that is. Going back to my other example, though, if I am not able to get myself out of that dangerous situation where this person is hurting me, then I'm going to move into fight mode. I can't flee. And so now I'm going to try to fight them off. And in that example, that probably does mean physically fight them off. It doesn't necessarily always mean that. Let's think about another classroom example where we're having a conversation with a student about, their 18 missing assignments that they have. And that student starts yelling at you, or just is really disrespectful, or maybe gets belligerent. And like, I'm just trying to have a conversation with you. Maybe that student does walk away from you. That's flight. They're trying to get themselves out of that situation. But what if they just start yelling back at you? Or what if they just won't even respond at all? Or they're arguing with you about, no, I turned that in, and they're not taking responsibility. That is a form of fight mode. That's what I mean when I say it doesn't necessarily have to be fist fighting. They're fighting with you through their words. They're arguing about, no, you're wrong. No, I turned that in. Or they're not responding at all because they've started to go into that shutdown mode and they're freezing up. So when we think of flight, fight, and freeze, I want you to keep in mind, it is not always running and fighting. And then I know we haven't even gotten to freeze yet, and I will here in just a second. We can see all of that bell curve, all of these different modes on a much smaller level in some of our interactions with kids in a classroom or in a school environment. So other things that happen during flight or fight mode, you see listed here. So our heart rate increases, our sweat glands maybe go into overdrive, our digestive system slows down, and our blood vessels constrict because we only want blood going to certain parts of our body. So if I need to try to run or try to fight off somebody who's trying to hurt me, then I need blood going to my legs or going to my arms and my hands. There's a reason that all of these things happen. And the whole reason is because our brain is trying to keep us alive in this situation. We are trying to survive. And in flight and fight mode, our mindset is still, we're going to get out of this situation. Maybe I'm going to be hurt in, some ways, whether that's physically or mentally, emotionally, but I'm going to somehow get out of this situation. When we move to that very top of our bell curve and move into freeze or shutdown mode, when we think about this mode, we are thinking about, in kind of the big intense examples that I've been giving, we're thinking about people who have kind of a break, a nervous break, or go into a dissociative state. People that maybe you have had a student. I know I've had a student that I have in mind that has truly, you have to call, 911 for help with them because they have gone into that freeze mode or that shutdown mode. This can happen for a lot of different reasons. It can happen, in people who have severe mental illnesses. This can happen when, in my example of being attacked, if I'm really hurt and my body is just trying to keep me alive at that point. And so a lot of the opposite things happen in freeze or shutdown mode. So rather than my heart beating really, really fast, and I have all of this adrenaline and all these other chemicals so that I can fight this person off, now everything is slowly shutting down. And the reason for that is that our nervous system wants us to be still, because by being still, we can hopefully survive this thing that's happening. We're really disconnected from reality at this point. So when we think about true freeze or shutdown mode, keep in mind, this is not something that you're going to probably see a lot of in a traditional school setting, but we can see this on those micro levels that I was talking about. The kid that just freezes up when we're trying to confront them about something. So there's a lot of different layers to this. So we've kind of worked through the bell curve at this point. So all of these modes that we've talked about, the flight, the fight, the freeze, these are meant to be a short-term response to a threat. So thinking about my example of walking down the street and being in danger, short-term, keep in mind, does not necessarily mean, just 5 minutes. It could mean a couple of hours. It could mean even weeks or days or weeks. But eventually our body is supposed to go back into balance, and all those chemicals and hormones that are being released are for a reason to help us at that time. But at some point, we should be going back to balance. What happens if that doesn't happen, though? So we're circling back to those kids that I was talking about, the kids where the thing that happens is here and their response is here. And so I want to do just a quick visualization to sort of get you in the mindset to understand what I'm talking about. So let's think for a minute, and I know I can't see most of you, so do this however you want to do it. Close your eyes, don't close your eyes, whatever feels right to you. But I want you to imagine that you are driving to work in the morning. Back in the days when we all had to actually go into the office every day or into school every day, right? We're driving to work in the morning and we're stopped at a red light and minding our own business, waiting for it to turn green. And all of a sudden, somebody hits us from behind. You did not see it coming. You were not expecting it. You have no idea what happened. Think for a second about how you're feeling in that moment, both in your brain, what you're thinking, and how is your body feeling in that moment. So maybe your hands are tense and you're gripping the steering wheel and you're wondering what just happened. Maybe you're thinking, am I hurt? Is the other person hurt? Maybe you're suddenly sweating bullets. Maybe, like most teachers and people who work in schools, because we all have similar type A personalities, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be late for work. Who's going to meet my kids that I have a group with this morning? Or who's going to be in my classroom to handle my class in the morning? Maybe you're thinking, I do not have time to deal with getting my car fixed and filing a report and an insurance claim, and none of that sounds fun. So a lot of those things are probably going through your head. You're probably feeling tense, anxious, nervous, overwhelmed, stressed out. Okay. So I want you to fast forward for a minute. We're going to pretend like you are all better people than I am, because you are going to continue your journey to work. We're assuming that nobody needs to go to the hospital, right? And our car is okay and it's drivable. So a lot of assumptions here, but you're going to not go back home and crawl under the covers and watch Netflix for the rest of the day like I would. You're going to go into work. And so somehow you make it there and you somehow make it through the day. Kids are asking you questions, you're having conversations, you have no idea what you're teaching them or what your answers are to them, right? But you somehow make it through the day. And you get to the end of the day and you have to go back out to your car to drive yourself home. So I want you to think for a second, how would you be feeling as you approach your car in the parking lot and you're thinking about driving home? I'm guessing all of that is flooding back again, right? And you're feeling really nervous. And as you're driving, maybe you're driving 25 miles an hour and you're thinking, everybody just go around me. Go around me. I'm going to get there safely. Maybe at the stoplights, you're constantly looking in your rear view mirror, waiting. Is somebody going to hit me? Do I need to, get it, swerve out of the way? What's going on behind me? And maybe this lasts for a couple of days, that feeling, whenever you have to get in your car. Maybe it's a couple of days, maybe it's a couple of weeks, maybe it's even longer. It all depends on a lot of different factors. How bad was the accident? How do you process your emotions and process stress? When I've asked this question in schools, I have gotten answers that literally run the gamut from I don't know that I would be able to drive for a very long time to I remember specifically somebody saying I would be perfectly fine. I really would. I could go to my car after school and not be nervous at all. And all of her colleagues agreed. They were like, yes, that is true. She is that person. It would not affect her in any way. And that's fine. There's no right or wrong. It's all just how we handle stress. Okay, but going back to that feeling, that hands on the steering wheel feeling is what I call that. The, oh my gosh, what just happened feeling. How many of you would really like to feel that feeling all day, every day? That, oh my gosh, I just got in an accident. And your brain is going through the 150 things that you're going to have to do now, that you're going to have to deal with, all the feelings that you're feeling right now. None of you, I'm guessing, would want to feel that way day in and day out. Because most of us have the tools and the strategies so that eventually we can get in our car and drive to the grocery store and not even think about it, right? And like I said, maybe it takes days, maybe it takes weeks, maybe it takes months. But eventually we get back in the car and we drive and we completely forget about that traumatic or stressful experience that we had. But what about our kids who are walking around like this all day, every day? Those are the kids that are already stuck, or not already stuck, they're already in flight mode because they're stuck in flight mode, because their level of stress or trauma or whatever you want to call it is heightened because their every single day is filled with stressful, traumatic experiences. So these are the kids that it seems like at the drop of a hat, they just go right on off the cliff, right? The smallest thing happens and their reaction is just over the top, it seems. So let's talk about those kids. So those flight, fight, and freeze modes that were supposed to be a short-term response have now become a long-term response for those kids or for those humans who are living with this day in and day out stress. It's relentless. At that point, their core regulation system becomes dysregulated because their body and their brain cannot make sense of what is going on. We're supposed to have this neat bell curve, right? Or we're supposed to have those little waves that we get stressed out and then we bring ourselves back down. But that's not happening for some people. And so their body isn't sure what to do. And so at this point, two things can happen. And really by default, one thing happens, and then hopefully we have the tools or we can give kids the tools to help them reach this kind of second thing. So the first thing that happens when we become dysregulated is, yes, there's another F mode. You thought there were only three, or maybe you only knew about flight or fight. But here's a fourth one. So we've got flight, fight, freeze, and now fold. And fold mode is when our body and brain just can't make sense of what all is happening. And we have become very dysregulated. We feel defeated, completely exhausted because our body is living in that chronic state of activation. That hands on the steering wheel feeling has become our normal. And that can go on for days, weeks, months at a time. We have people that have lived for years this way. And yes, if you jump ahead, you will see those are the people that have PTSD, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed, right? They are living in that chronic state of activation for very long periods of time. And what happens is that any little sensory trigger sends them back or sends them over the edge. So these kids that we think, why did you just respond like that? Well, it's because they're standing on the edge of the cliff and all it's going to take is one little breeze to push them right off. So whether that trigger is a sound or a touch or a smell. It can be anything sensory. I mean, the ones that we hear a lot about are, our military personnel who have been in combat zones, right? And so fireworks around the 4th of July are a trigger because obviously it's a loud boom that sounds very similar to bombs going off and gunfire and things that they experience in a combat zone. That's a sensory trigger, but it can be anything. I have heard countless stories over the years, stories that blow your mind of things that you would never imagine being triggers. A principal that was telling me about a student that he worked with when he was a special education teacher, and he wore a yellow shirt to school one day, not his normal color. That yellow shirt was a trigger for one of his students because it was so similar to the color of the shirt that his abuser wore. Things that he would never think about that, right? Getting in your closet in the morning, choosing a shirt. You would and there's no way to know these things. Colognes, perfumes that trigger certain memories. All of those things that happen when you're experiencing a traumatic event are stored in your brain, and they're not stored well. So using our car accident example, when we get in a car accident, you don't even realize that your brain is taking hundreds of little pictures of all of the things around us and storing the sounds and the smells and the sights of all of the things at that intersection that you got in an accident at. And it's storing them, and they may come out weeks, months, years later as triggers, or just those things that we have that make us go, huh, why does that thing seem familiar? Or why does that thing make me feel weird inside or nervous inside? Our brain is not great at storing things in a sensical manner when we are experiencing trauma and stress. And so anything can come back as a trigger. So maybe it's a loud noise that triggers a student, or maybe it's somebody touching them in a certain part of their body that is a trigger. Maybe it's yelling is the trigger, or people being loud. And when that happens, that immediately sends them back into that flight and fight mode. And that's going to continue happening until that trauma or that stress is resolved and processed, whether that's through therapy or whatever. We can live in fold mode. We can live with PTSD, as you know, for years and years and years. We don't want to, though. We don't want our kids living on the edge of the cliff like that. So what is our other option? Our other option is teaching kids about the vagus nerve. What is the vagus nerve? You might be wondering. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. If you remember back to our original slide, we were talking about the polyvagal theory. That's where that name comes from. So the vagus nerve is one of 12 cranial nerves in your body. It runs from your brain stem all down through your body to your intestinal system. And the cool thing about it is that it has a couple of really important jobs. One being that it's like the key player in the mind-body connection. The other important job that it has is it is responsible for turning off the amygdala, the stress response. Remember, our amygdala is our smoke detector that sometimes goes off more often than we need it to go off. And the vagus nerve, when we activate it, can deactivate our amygdala. It's kind of weird to say it that way or think about it that way, but we have to turn on the vagus nerve so that it can turn off the amygdala. So how do we do that? It's not as complicated as we think. We activate the vagus nerve through things like deep breathing, singing, humming, meditation, yoga, exercise, hugs, laughing, human contact. A lot of those things that we talked about at the beginning when I was asking you, what do you do to help yourself de-escalate or to bring your body back into balance, that social engagement? Those things work because when you do them, you are activating your vagus nerve. You probably just had no idea that that's what was happening. Deep breathing, for instance. When we breathe deeply or teach our kids mindful breathing, we are actually sending a message to our brain, hey, we need to slow down the heart. We're sending a message to our brain saying, I'm trying to calm down here by breathing, mindfully. And then our brain gets the message and says, okay, yeah, we're going to send a message to the heart now to slow down your heart rate. And what happens when your heart rate slows down is you start to calm down. So there really is science behind it. It's not just, if you're like me, I find myself telling my kids, like, you need to take a breath right now when they're, which is actually not like the best thing to tell them. But there's a reason we say that, or we, kind of revert to thinking about deep breathing, because it does work, along with all of these other things that some of us probably are using already. Human contact. Think about the people during the pandemic that were really struggling because they were huggers, and we were like, stay away from people. In fact, stay 6 feet away from all people. And those people that are physical touch people, if you're familiar with, the 5 love languages, or they're just people that need, that human contact, they struggled with that because that is how they feel safe and secure. We have a lot of kids out there like that. They need that human contact. Some of them, laughing helps, telling jokes, being silly. Some of them sing or hum. How many of us know a person that constantly whistles or hums? And if you're like me, it drives you absolutely nuts because I cannot stand those noises. And we think it's sort of like just a nervous habit. For them, it's probably actually a very calming habit. And a lot of times they don't even realize that they're doing it. I have one of my kids is a whistler, and it makes me crazy. And he doesn't realize that he's doing it. And he does it though. It's very calming for him. It helps him calm down. And I'll be like, can you please stop whistling? It's driving me crazy. And he's like, I was whistling? Yes, you were. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing the thing that is helpful to us. Okay, so once our vagus nerve is activated by figuring out that mind-body connection, that's what we were doing with a lot of those things that we were just looking at, are sort of like mindfulness strategies, right? Things that we know as kind of being more in tune with ourself and our body. Those are the things that we want to practice. And then we need to continue practicing them to help us return back to that social engagement, into that balanced state. Okay, so I know we are running short on time. The last kind of few pieces are much shorter than the brain part. So how does that then in turn impact our learning? Because we know that there's all this stuff going on in our kids' brains. And so that is clearly going to impact their learning then, right? So I want to talk for a second about this idea of learning brain versus survival brain. And I put a picture of a bridge here because I think of this like a bridge. We have learning brain on one side of the bridge, survival brain on the other side of the bridge. But we can have kids anywhere along that bridge, anywhere. And they're all, if you think about your class as we're talking about this, or a group of kids that you work with, you're probably going to recognize that they're all kind of sprinkled throughout that bridge. Learning brain is very similar to social engagement. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. They come in and they're ready to learn. It's what we talked about earlier. It's where I hoped that most of you were when you sat down at your computer this morning. Survival brain is where a lot of our kids are who have experienced stress and trauma. They're anticipating a threat. They're stressed out. They see things as very black or white. There's not a lot of room for debate and thinking about things from other people's perspectives. These are our kids that they're not coming to school to learn the new phonics rule that we are ready to teach, or to practice the multiplication times tables. They are coming to school looking for something entirely different. Connection, relationship, security, belonging, love, safety, all of those things. And we have to meet those needs before we can meet their academic needs. The more time our kids spend over here in survival brain, the harder it is to get them back to learning brain. The goal here is that we incrementally move them along the bridge. And maybe we never get all the way back over here, but even somewhere in the middle is better than being all the way over here. So what does this mean in terms of their learning? So thinking about, and I'm not going to read over all of this, but you can kind of pick out the bold piece of the things that I've bolded. Thinking about all of those hormones that are released when we experience trauma and stress. Here are the things that can happen, not necessarily will, but can happen to impact brain development. Because those hormones coursing through our bodies day in and day out, that's not a good thing. If they are being released into your body to help you get away from somebody who's trying to mug you on the street, fine, they're doing their job. And then we get back to balance. But if these hormones are constantly coursing through our body because we're experiencing stress and trauma every single day, that's not good. We know that we have this idea of neuroplasticity. Our brain has the ability to change, both for the better and for worse. Keeping in mind that the younger a child is when they experience trauma, the worse off they can be because their brain is developing more quickly. And so it's more susceptible to all of those hormones. So all of this, I know it's lots of words, you can go back and look at it a little bit more, results in these things that we see in schools. And again, I'm not saying that these things are, if you have a kid that has some of these characteristics, that doesn't necessarily mean that they do have trauma. They could. There's a lot of overlap between trauma and ADHD and lots of different mental illnesses and other disabilities. And there's so much that it could be. Figuring out a kid's past experience is like putting a puzzle together. We're never going to have all the pieces. But trauma can result in a lot of these things that we see in kids in our classrooms every single day. And then taking it one step even further, and this is the last piece. How does it impact their behavior then? Well, you can probably make a very educated guess at this point, right? About how kids' behavior is going to be impacted. So we have this idea of private logic, and I don't love that term because most of us have not heard that term, but you can probably relate to the term like core values. We have our core values or our value system, whatever you want to call it. And that's basically how we perceive the world around us. What do we think about ourselves? What do we believe about ourselves and the people around us? And obviously, trauma is going to shape our core values or our private logic. And then that drives our behavior. We behave in a certain way because we have been taught to be afraid of this, or we've seen our parents do that, or talk to people this way. Our private logic drives our behavior. And for many of our kids, behavior is their means of communication. And this is not just in the kids that we think, like toddlers, right? We think of toddlers, they don't have the verbal skills or the words to communicate their needs and their wants. And so they throw a tantrum, in the middle of the grocery store aisle. Well, guess what? High school students are not all that different. Whether it's because they can't access the language area of their brain or they just don't know how to communicate it effectively, so they use behavior. So what contributes to our private logic or our core value system? All of these different things. All of these things contribute to turning us into the person that we are, which then drives how we behave, how we treat other people, how we respond when different situations arise. All of this goes into that. And stress and trauma is just one little piece of it. But if that is taking over your whole life is trauma and stress and being yelled at or being abused or whatever it is, then that is going to result in it making up a big piece of your value system or your private logic. And then we all have these statements of private logic. And that basically, is we're behaving in this certain way because of this thing that happened and because of our needs that we have. So these are not the only 5 statements of private logic. There are hundreds, millions. Statements of private logic can be positive or negative. So for the most part, I've used negative statements here, but because of what we're talking about, but there are plenty of positive statements of private logic. It's the way the behavior manifests in a human, in a student, as a result of their private logic and their needs. So maybe we have a kid whose statement of private logic is, I don't trust you, so I will do whatever I have to do to try to control you. They're not actually saying that, but their behavior is saying that. So perhaps, skipping ahead just for a minute, if they're trying to control you, maybe these are the kids that you're constantly getting into power struggles with, or they're trying to get in a power struggle with you, or they're arguing with you, or they're bullying other kids because they are trying to control the other kids in the classroom or in the group. Their behaviors stem from that statement of private logic. So what do we do about that? Because nobody has the time to figure out every kid's statement of private logic, right? That's really tricky. We have to remember that their misbehavior is usually not symptomatic of something being wrong with them. We have to, as teachers, as social workers, as counselors, administrators, whoever we are, we have to reframe the behavior and use it as a clue. And we do that by recognizing that it's only one piece of the puzzle and asking ourselves why. Why is this child behaving in this way? What happened to them? What is happening to them? Because at the end of the day, most kids do not wake up in the morning going, how can I press her buttons today? How can I get under her skin and drive her absolutely crazy? I always say 9 out of 10 kids do not wake up in the morning that way, because there's always that one kid, right? That is their whole goal in life. But 9 out of 10 kids, they are not laying in bed in the morning plotting how to get under your skin. That's just not what they're doing. They are coming in and behaving in such a way because of all of this baggage that they have and how they are processing it. And we have to ask ourselves, what happened to them? What is happening? Why are they behaving this way? How can I use their behavior to my advantage in this situation? Because often we can find the strength in most behaviors. Because as much as I wish we had a little magic wand to make it go away, none of us have that, right? There are things that we can do and strategies that we can teach kids, but we don't have a magic wand to just make them all these perfect little humans that aren't driving us nuts every single day. We have to find the strength in their behavior, make it work to our advantage. So just as we get to the point where we're wrapping up here, what can we do from here? We have all of this information, and this training was really not strategy based. A lot of what I do is strategy based. So you get a lot of information about what is going on. And I would not be surprised if your question is, great, but what do we do about it? And that is a natural next question. But in terms of what we learned today, think about how you can share it with people in your building or your colleagues. How can this help people that maybe are not understanding what is happening in our kids' brains and their bodies because of their situations that they're in? The people that do think that the kids are just trying to get under their skin and press their button, they're here to drive me nuts. That's their sole purpose on this planet. How can we empower our kids to understand how their brain works? This is a huge piece that not a lot of schools do. How can we teach kids strategies? How can we fill their toolboxes with strategies for de-escalating, coping skills? How can we incorporate a proactive mindfulness practice into our day to help kids kind of be more in balance. So rather than being reactive when they are escalated, how can we start being proactive with them? How can we model some of these strategies? Or even the talking about our feelings and how we feel and how it's making us feel. Thinking about the car accident activity that we did. And I asked, how are you feeling? How in your brain and in your body? Making that connection for kids, talking through that. In our house, we talk a little ad nauseum, probably, about how things make us feel. Because I want my kids to be self aware. I want them to understand what's happening in their brain when they get upset and they fly off the handle and they say things that they regret. We all have those moments. I want them to understand the why behind that. So, how can we start to empower both our students and our teachers or colleagues or whoever you work with in your work environment to better understand this so they can be more successful in whatever their job is? So, you have some ideas here, and then I will just leave you before I turn it back to Amanda with all the places that you can find me, because I share a lot about this in all of the different places that I am, different strategies that we can be using to fill their toolboxes. And also my email is here again, because, and I just want to reiterate, you are always more than welcome to email me if you have questions or need a follow-up resource about something that I talked about. I know I went through some of this quickly, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have questions about anything that we talked about. With that, I will just say thank you for being here on an early morning here at the end of summer. I appreciate you guys learning alongside me this morning. I hope that it was beneficial. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for this information. What a great way to kind of just learn a little bit about the behavior, and then you're, talking about teaching this to kids, connecting that the brain and the behavior is so important. So really appreciate your session today. Perhaps we'll touch base on a follow-up session on those, next steps. Diving in a little bit deeper into those would be really great. So thanks again. Elisa, if you want to go ahead and advance the next few slides through as I talk through real quick as I close. I did put into the chat the PGP form. So if you want to access that PGP point for today, and also it's a very short session evaluation. So we would greatly appreciate you filling that out. Go ahead and advance. Just wanted to share very quickly some upcoming Counselor Connect events. We have a lot planned for the school year, and we are super excited about all of these things. To stay informed, I would suggest you subscribe to that monthly Counselor Connect newsletter. We posted registration for some of the things that are kicking off in August, which include a counselor leadership cadre. This is a year-long series that includes one day in person to kick off, and then followed by all virtual monthly sessions. And that will be presented by Hatching Results. So for any school counselors on today's session, you are probably familiar with Hatching Results and their great work that they do. So really excited to have them join us this year for that. School Counselor Institutes, we have an elementary day, September 12th, and a secondary institute, September 13th. That will also be presented by Hatching Results trainers. So hopefully you can join us at CASD in Indianapolis for one of those 2 days. We have our Comprehensive School Counselor Institute. If you want to work towards that, carrying the torch, that registration for that is now posted. That is free registration, and we have two different options available. One is for those completing the first year or the bronze and silver levels, and the other one is for those completing year 2, working towards that gold level. The Department of Education just recently announced that we have reciprocity with ASCA RAMP. So if you do complete that Carrying the Torch gold level, then you will automatically then receive RAMP with that. Obviously, you'll have to still apply for RAMP, but it will be, there's that reciprocity there. So that's really exciting news. And if you want to go forward, just a few more events that we have planned. Oh, that's okay. Let me look on my slide deck here.
Sorry, I just happened
that's okay,
where there was a link.
You're fine. We're also
Okay.
offering a year-long cadre for new school counselors. So anybody in year 1 or 2 as a counselor, we are connecting those new counselors with a mentor and also offering some targeted professional development for you. We have career counseling workshop series planned for the year. And then in the spring, we're offering a couple of data development workshops as well as a work-based learning workshop. So many things happening along with our monthly virtual professional development. We'll be releasing more information about some of those sessions as well coming up soon. And then the last slide is just contact information. If you need to contact me, if you'd like to subscribe to those newsletters, this is where you will find how to do that. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful start to your school year. Elisa, thank you so much again for your presentation.
Thank
And
you.
with that, we will say goodbye. Thanks, everybody. Take care.